When all hope seemed lost and darkness ruled, have you ever thought about what it would be like to live? People often say that the Dark Ages were the worst time in human history. It was a time of chaos, ignorance, and fear. But what was so bad about this time? Come with us as we try to figure out why millions of people had to fight to stay alive during plagues, invasions, and the end of civilization. Are you ready to learn the shocking truths about this terrible time period and why it should still serve as a warning to all people? The Dark Ages were the early Middle Ages in Europe, which lasted from about the 5th century to the 10th century. The time after the fall of the Western Roman Empire is often marked by broad political instability, economic decline, hard times to get an education, and bad living conditions. Many people think this was the worst time to be living, but this opinion can be very subjective and depend on where you live and your personal circumstances. However, there are a few main reasons why people think this way. Instability in politics. The governmental instability that followed the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD was one of the main things that made the Dark Ages so hard. When this centralized authority fell apart, there was a lack of power, which caused areas to be split up into smaller countries. As feudal lords and local warlords rose to power, they set up their own kingdoms with little government or control. Because of this, security became a big issue for many. There wasn't a strong political framework, so there was constant fighting over territory. Communities were stuck between two or more competing groups, and it was often harder for local leaders to keep things under control. Many people felt unsafe and exposed because of the unstable political situation, which made the problems of daily life even harder. Drop in the economy. When Rome fell, it had huge effects on the economy. Trade networks that were strong during the Roman era got worse, which caused the economy to drop significantly. Since many towns were destroyed and roads were getting worse, long-distance trade became less common. As money became less common, trading goods for goods became the main way people bought and sold things. Many people's standard of living went down because of the economic slump. People had to go into subsistence farming because cities were going out of business and jobs were being lost. They were mostly peasants who worked the land under a feudal system and didn't always get much in return. People in those areas were poor and had a hard time meeting their basic wants, which made life difficult. Not enough education and knowledge. A lot of people lost their ability to read and write during the Dark Ages. It wasn't easy for information to get around after centralized organizations, and the Roman educational system fell apart. Most people couldn't read or write, which made it harder to keep information alive. Monasteries were some of the last places where people could still learn, and scribes lived there to copy old texts and keep religious lessons alive. But only a small group of people had access to this information. The vast mass of people were still unaware. People who didn't go to school were more likely to believe in superstitions and be afraid, and they used illogical reasons to explain their problems. Invasion and battle. Invasions from groups like the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Muslims happened a lot during the Dark Ages. Invasions like these made daily life difficult and destroyed villages, forcing people to move. A lot of the time, communities weren't ready to defend themselves against these raids, which led to deaths and damage. People were afraid and didn't know what to do because of the ongoing threat of invasion. People lived in towns that were fortified and were protected by militias in their areas. But these steps often weren't enough to stop the well-organized bands of invaders, which made the situation even more unstable and hopeless during this time. Problems with disease and health. During the Dark Ages, people also had serious health problems, which were made worse by a lack of medical understanding and bad hygiene. In both country and urban areas, living in crowded places made it easier for diseases to spread. Later, epidemics like the bubonic plague would do a lot of damage, but diseases like smallpox and measles were common before these breakouts. High death rates were caused by people not knowing enough about health and cleanliness. Many people died of illnesses that could have been treated in later centuries because they couldn't get medical help. During the Dark Ages, many people's quality of life was even worse because they were always at risk of getting sick and suffering. Stalling of technology. In the Dark Ages, the loss of organized power slowed down the progress of technology. Innovations slowed down a lot when governments weren't strong enough to back building infrastructure. A lot of the progress that was made during the Roman Empire, like aqueducts, roads, and public pools, got worse over time, and people often forgot how to keep them in good shape. Agricultural practices stayed simple, and it took a while for growing methods to get better. Some improvements, like the three-field system, did come about in the end, but generally the rate of technological progress was slower than in previous times. At that time, people were having a hard time with their finances and lives because of this standstill. Structure of society. The noble system grew out of the chaos of the Middle Ages. It brought some order to a time when politics were broken up. In this system, vassals were loyal to their masters and served in the army in exchange for land. Feudalism gave those in power some safety, but it also created a rigid class system that made it hard to move up in society. Peasants often had to work the land they owned and were responsible to their masters. They also didn't have many rights of their own. People had a hard time getting better because they didn't have enough freedom and opportunities. Huge differences in wealth and power led to social unrest and stress, which made life even more difficult during this time. Effects of religion. During the Dark Ages, when the Catholic Church was in charge, it had a big impact on society. Monasteries were places where people could learn and keep their information safe, which helped bring back education and culture in the long run. But the church also had an effect on people's minds, often making it harder for people to disagree and try out new ideas. A society of conformity was created when the church's dogma often told people what to do and how to behave. There was some stability in religious organizations, but they also spread fear and ignorance. People who didn't agree with established views were at risk of being persecuted, which made people less likely to think critically and come up with new ideas. Expressions of culture. In spite of all the problems, there was still artistic expression during the Dark Ages. During this time, cultural history was kept alive through manuscripts and art. Illuminated manuscripts and religious art showed off the artistic skills of the time. As a result, monasteries and churches became places where knowledge and culture were kept safe, protecting what was left of traditional learning. Even though religious ideas were often at the center of cultural expression, it paved the way for future artistic growth. Texts that were kept safe and the art of the time would eventually lead to the Renaissance, which was a renewed interest in art and knowledge from the past. Chivalry in the Middle Ages. During the Dark Ages, the idea of knighthood also grew, which emphasized goodness like honor, bravery, and loyalty. In spite of the chaos, knights followed a set of rules that gave them a sense of order and hope. This rule of chivalry changed social norms and expectations, which in turn changed how lords, vassals, and commoners interacted with each other. Chivalry made war and being a hero seem more romantic, but it also made people feel more duty-bound and responsible. The ideas of chivalry would later have an impact on writing, art, and social norms, leaving behind a cultural legacy of the Middle Ages. New ideas in agriculture. During the Dark Ages, farming was very important for keeping people alive. Even though there were problems, improvements like the three-field system and better plowing methods finally made farming more productive. These new ideas helped settle some areas, which led to more food production and the ability to support more people. As farming techniques got better, towns slowly started to get better. Because there was too much food, some people were able to start hobbies and trades, which helped local economies and markets grow. The start of towns. As trade lines and economic networks slowly got better near the end of the Dark Ages, cities and towns began to form around important trade hubs. These cities grew into economic hubs that helped trade and business get back on their feet. In the early Middle Ages, people lived alone in the countryside. When towns started to appear, it made people more linked. As towns got bigger, there were more chances to trade, make goods, and share ideas. In the Middle Ages, the cultural and economic scene would be greatly affected by the growing number of cities. Getting ready for the Middle Ages. In the last few hundred years of the Dark Ages, scholars often talk about a change to the High Middle Ages. During this time, trade slowly started to grow again, organized power returned to some areas, and medieval universities were built, which sparked a renewed interest in learning. The foundations that were put during the Dark Ages made it possible for later periods of progress and cultural growth. Differences by region. It's important to remember that different places had very different experiences during the Dark Ages. Some parts of Western Europe were going through a lot of problems, but places like the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world were mostly stable and culturally thriving during this time. Together, the preservation of information in these areas and progress in science, math, and philosophy would have an impact on the Renaissance and history as a whole. Dark Ages were marked by a wide range of problems such as political instability, economic problems, poor schooling, frequent invasions, and health problems. In spite of the fact that many people had a hard time during this era, it is important to remember that it was also a time of culture preservation, innovation, and setting the stage for future progress. The word Dark Ages is often used in a bad way, which makes the complicated times of that time seem less important. Many people had a hard time during that time, but it also set the stage for big changes in the ages that followed. History often shows that even the worst times can make people stronger, help them adapt, and eventually help them grow. This shows that people have a strong will to survive. Enjoyed uncovering the mysteries of the Dark Ages with us? Don't miss out on more fascinating history lessons. Hit that subscribe button and join our community for captivating content that brings the past to life.